This is a Britain for Europe podcast. On January the 16th, 2017, Professor A.C. Grayling delivered a talk to a packed lantern room at Colston Hall, Bristol. The event was followed by an audience Q&A. The evening was chaired by Stephen Perry, and the event was organised by Bristol for Europe. 16 Million Rising was there to capture every word in full, and together with Britain for Europe is proud to present Anthony Grayling, Fighting for Europe.
You're here for one reason tonight, and that, of course, is to listen to Professor Anthony Grayling. I contacted him about 4 weeks ago, expecting it to be difficult to get him to come. But in fact, instantly he said, yes, I'll come. He's quite a busy man. I'm just about to tell you briefly. I've got such a long list of things related to his accomplishments that I'm not going to run through them all. But he said this is going to be called Fighting for Europe. And he says those of us who are keen to see the UK remain part of the EU need to target our fight carefully. How shall we do that, and when? Now, Professor Grayling is a master of the New College of the Humanities at St Anne's College, Oxford. He's written and edited over 30 books on philosophy, and indeed it is as a philosopher perhaps that he's best known. He's a frequent contributor to the Literary Review, The Observer, Independent on Sunday, The Times, Literary Supplement, Index on Censorship, and New Statesman. But I think I've seen him most often on things like TV, or, as he's mentioned here, Radios 4, BBC Radios 4, Radio 3, and the World Service. There is much else I could say. He's the Vice President of the British Humanist Association. He's a Fellow of the World Economic Forum, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. We call him the brains of Remain. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anthony Grayling.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Very kind and almost completely accurate.
Almost.
Thank you so much. Well, we are living through a really, really seriously important time. I've said, and I say in the letter, which I think copies of which have been given to you this evening, just sent today to all the MPs, I'm trying to harass them as vigorously as I can, that this is the greatest crisis that our country has faced for 70 years, since the end of the Second World War. It really is that important. And for that reason, those of us who are very keen to see the UK remain part of the EU have to get up and act. It may be that some of us haven't before now written to MPs or gone on demonstrations or taken other kind of action, but this is certainly the moment to do it. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is to do three things. Firstly, I'd just like to put out some reminders about what we should always insist on being recognised about the current situation. These are familiar points, but we need to make them often. We need to insist on them and repeat them. The second thing is I want to read you something that the Department for Exiting the EU put out in response to a petition request recently, because the wording of it is really important. It tells you something about the tone and indeed something about the very intransigence of our government at the moment on the matter of Brexit. And the third thing, and the most important thing, and the point of the evening, is to talk a bit about the strategies that we can follow to try to keep us in the EU. So on the first point then, the reminders. They are this. When the results came in on the 24th of June, day after the referendum last year, those of us who are really passionate about our membership of the EU woke up in shock at the news. 51.9% of the people who had voted on the day voted to leave the EU. A little reflection on those numbers shows us that represents 37% of the people who were given the franchise for that referendum. I put that in those words because, of course, the franchise was restricted. 16 and 17-year-olds were not given a vote in the referendum, despite the fact that the future of the UK and its relationship with the EU is a very material matter to them. So they were excluded. A large class of expatriates were excluded. These are people who live and work abroad and have done so for more than a certain length of time. EU citizens living in the UK, people who've come here to work, who've been here for a long time, who've raised families here and who pay taxes here, were not given the vote. They were, by the way, given the vote in the Scottish independence referendum back in 2014, as indeed were 16 and 17-year-olds, as indeed were expatriates. So the way that the franchise was organised for the EU referendum last year is at very least a little odd. But the result is that 37% of those who had been given the franchise voted to leave. 37% of them. And the really significant point about that is that there is almost nowhere in the civilized world, apart from, if you can include North Korea in the civilized world, which I doubt, and a handful of other countries, where a major constitutional change of this kind, together with a serious loss of rights, like the right of free movement in Europe and to live and work elsewhere in Europe, together with all the other rights that we've accumulated in the years that we've been part of the EU. No major country would make a change to its constitution or deprive its citizens of important rights on anything less than a supermajority. 60% or 66%, 2/3 of the electorate, or of those people who voted on the day of a referendum. Only that would be regarded as sufficient for making a change of this momentous nature. And the government that we have is trying to hustle us out of the EU as fast as possible on the basis of a 37% of the electorate vote. That's point number one that has to be remembered. The second point that has to be remembered is that the referendum was advisory. On the 3rd of June, in 2015, 2 years ago now, a document was issued to MPs by the House of Commons Library, a briefing paper 07212, if you want to look it up. Section 5 says, this referendum is advisory only. It doesn't bind either Parliament or the government to act on its outcome. Section 6 of that document says, if there were any suggestion whatever that there would be a change, such as leaving the EU would involve a major constitutional change and change in the rights of the citizens of the UK, then a supermajority would be required. Now, this is a document that was sent to MPs in advance of the debate in the House of Commons on the 2015 referendum bill. Perhaps not all of them read it. They certainly should have done. That would have been their responsibility. But they certainly act now as if they hadn't read it, because now they seem to be taking the outcome of the referendum as if it were binding and mandatory, as if there is no option but to act on the basis of the fact that on the day, the people who came out and cast their votes, 51.9 of them voted to leave. But Parliament is sovereign. Parliament should be debating the outcome of the advisory referendum, and the point that it should be debating is, should we take the advice of the advisory referendum? Is this really in the interests of the country? We, the MPs, should be saying to themselves, we are informed about this, and we've considered this, and this is something that we know about. We are full-time politicians, paid a salary to think about these things and look into them and make a sober judgment about them. Is this really in the interests of the country? And it is their duty, indeed it's a duty which is specified in the information given to MPs when they become MPs, to act in the best interests of the country. It takes the kind of judgment that you might make very late at night after a long evening at the pub to think that Brexit could be in the interests of anybody other than certain members of the political right wing and certain others who think that being outside the EU might be in their business interests. So Parliament is sovereign. And what we've noticed is a really astonishing thing, which is that the government doesn't want there to be a full debate in the House of Commons and the House of Lords with a free, unwhipped vote on whether or not the advice of the advisory referendum should be taken. This is astonishing and unconscionable. I will read you a passage in a moment from the Department for Exiting the EU, which tries to persuade people who read that document they've issued that there will be a parliamentary debate on the so-called Great Reform or Great Repeal Bill, which would happen after Brexit when all the EU laws that apply in our country are repealed. But that, of course, is far, far too late. We want that debate in Parliament now. This is when it should be happening, and it should be happening, as I say, in an unwhipped way. That is, that the MP should have a free vote at the end of the debate. And the reason for wanting that is that we know that the great majority of members of both houses of Parliament are for Remain. And they are for Remain because they've presumably looked into the matter and know something about it, and in their judgment, we're better in than out. When people ask, why is it that our members of Parliament, members of the House of Commons anyway, because we have yet to hear from the Lords, and we know that there are a lot of muttering in the House of Lords about their efforts, keeping their powder dry on this one, about how they can try to stop us from leaving the EU. But members of the House of Commons, who seem like rabbits in the headlight, they seem paralyzed by the nature of the vote on the day, so that they have, as it were, given up a grasp of the fact this is an advisory referendum, and that they, in their parliament, have a sovereign right to discuss it and to decide whether or not to act on it. They seem to have given that up to treat this as a binding outcome. And if you ask the reason why, I think part of the reason is this, that most of them were elected on about 37% of the vote in their constituencies, which they've come to believe to be a majority. This is the result of our extremely poor electoral system in this country. People say, oh, well, you know, the government is elected on about that percentage, and we all accept that they're the government of the day. The answer to that is, this wasn't a general election. This wasn't something that can be recalled in a couple of years' time. This was a referendum. Now, let us just very briefly remind ourselves that the referendum was called for no good reason. There was no reason to hold a referendum. This is a very, very badly self-inflicted wound. It was called by David Cameron to shut up the right wing of his party, A, and B, to try to salvage a few votes might have gone to UKIP in Conservative constituencies. Open brackets, it turns out that it's the Labour Party who tend to be suffering from people decamping to UKIP just as much as the Conservative Party, close brackets, but that's another story. So the referendum was called as an internal party political ploy, and it all went very, very badly wrong. And to compound matters, the nature of the campaigns, I have to say both campaigns have many, many flaws, but the Leave campaign beggars belief from the point of view of the misinformation and distortions, outright lies and falsehoods and misleading promises that were made during the course of it. I know, this being Bristol, you were all reading Daniel Kahneman in the bath last night, Thinking Fast and Slow, you know, the stuff about how to think rationally. And so you will know that perhaps inadvertently, the psychologists and economists who think about thinking in these ways have told those who run campaigns how they can manipulate sentiment in those campaigns. In fact, I had several conversations, indeed, with a very, very senior news editor at the BBC in London who told me that during the run-up to the referendum, before the referendum actually happened, the BBC was having an internal quarrel with itself about how it was reporting the campaigns. Because they recognized, the news editors at the BBC, they recognized that they were being played. They were being played in the following way. That very late at night or very early in the morning, a press release would be sent out, some claim or statement by somebody on the Leave side, and it would be reported on the Today programme on the radio, which, as you know, sets the agenda for the news discussion of the day. And however willfully misleading or distorting or outrageous the claim might be, it would be reported, and then the people who had made it would be tackled a few hours later, and they might very well retract it or modify it, by which time it's far too late, because the claim is out there, or the assertion is out there, the outrageous statement has got into the public domain, and on the Kahneman view about thinking fast and slow, it's the fast thinkers, that is the ones who don't think very much, who do things on the basis of sentiment or emotion or really wanting to believe certain things. They've accepted this, and they won't hang around to listen to the retraction or the correction later. And this happened in the Trump campaign as well. It happened big time in the Trump campaign, rather remarkably, seeing it from this side of the Atlantic, but it happened in the referendum campaign also. So the referendum was called for no good reason. It was an internal party political matter, and the campaigns that led up to it were very, very far from being a paradigm of calm, rational provision of information so that people could go to the polls in a well-instructed and well-informed way. It was the very opposite of that. So we must remember those things too. And finally, we must remember why it is that the EU matters. There are two kinds of things that we might say here. We might point to the fact that if you know anything about the history of Europe over the last 2,000 years and more, you will know that especially in the last, let us say, 500 or 600 years, when it took a leading role in world affairs with globalization and colonization and the development of science and secularism, that it has been a cockpit of war and conflict right up until the middle of the 20th century, sometimes absolutely appalling war and conflict. We know about the Second World War and the First World War. You can go back to the 17th century and look at the 30 Years' War, which was then one of the bitterest wars that Europe had ever experienced. 1 in every 3 Central Europeans lost their lives in that conflict, either directly or indirectly, leaving parts of Europe devastated for generations, not merely for 10 or 20 or 30 years of recovery and restoration afterwards. Europe has been, because of its very energy and its inventiveness, had been at war with itself, a great big, if you like, internecine civil war on the continent of Europe for centuries. The European Union has brought peace. You have only to look at a documentary of the Second World War, look at the bombing, look at bombed cities, look at millions of refugees and displaced persons, and ask yourself whether or not the great project of peace, progress and prosperity in Europe is not something which is so profoundly worth admiring and worth working to keep alive. But there are other reasons too. Think back, those of you who can remember, to the early 1970s and before that, to the economy of this country. It was in most tremendous decline. We were having terrible struggles here before we joined the EU. After joining the European communities it then was, and from the time of Maastricht in the early 90s, the economy of this country has really recovered. Until the June of last year, this was the 5th biggest economy in the world, and it was doing well. Immediately after the referendum vote, it slipped to 7th because of the loss of investment, loss of the value of the pound, and loss of confidence in the country and its economy and its future. Think of that too. Think of the economic benefits that we've accrued from the EU. But there is yet a further reason. When I think about Europe, I think about, say this sounds rather precious, but I love the idea of being part of a grand story in which Goethe and Beethoven and Descartes and Vermeer and Rembrandt and Leonardo da Vinci are all our fellows, all part of the same story that we belong to. It is this extraordinary story. The upside story of Europe is an extraordinary story. And to be part of that, part of this great movement of the last several centuries, especially since the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which has had such a huge impact on the world as a whole, in many respects for good, of course in a number of respects for ill as well, but until we stop fighting one another and quarrelling with one another, until, in other words, the beginnings of the EU project back in the very early 1950s, since then it has been a matter of pride to be part of that. So this is something which is really well worth arguing for and wanting to remain part of. So these are things that we must remind ourselves of. There is no mandate for Brexit. There is no binding license. The use of expressions like the will of the people, the UK has spoken, Britain has voted to leave, is dishonest. It is factually incorrect to say that the people have spoken or Britain has decided to leave when 26% of the population voted to leave. And anything which is factually incorrect and known to be factually incorrect has a much shorter and simpler and more accurate word to describe it, and that word is, it's a lie. It's just a straightforward lie to say that the people, the will of the people, is to leave the EU. That's one thing to remember. The second thing to remember, the point about the sovereignty of Parliament and the duty of our MPs is going to be very significant in what I say a bit later on about what we should do to try to stop things. But now I want to read. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to squint at my phone to do this. It's a rather remarkable device. Invented in Europe, by the way. I tried to print this out, but I couldn't. So I'm going to read this to you. This is a statement put out by the Department for Exiting the European Union, known as DEXU. Do you remember that slang expression when somebody hit you and knocked you down? That was called decking you, wasn't it? So DEXU, I suppose, is about right. So the DEXU has issued this in response to a petition request to discuss the reason why Parliament is not taking seriously the fact that the referendum was advisory only. And it reads as follows. On 23rd of June 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union in a referendum provided for by an Act of Parliament. We, in government, are committed to implementing the democratic outcome of the referendum. The government will bring forward legislation in the next session that, when enacted, will repeal the European Communities Act 1972 on the day we leave the EU. This great repeal bill, quotes unquote, will end the authority of EU law and return power to the UK. The Prime Minister has been clear that there can be no attempts to remain inside the EU, no attempts to rejoin it through the back door, and no second referendum. Parliament will have every opportunity to debate and scrutinise the Great Repeal Bill during its passage through Parliament. Now, I'm going to deconstruct this, okay? The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. It did not. As I've just said, 26% of the population did, and it is dishonest, consciously dishonest, to claim otherwise. We are committed to implementing the democratic outcome of the referendum. If 26% of the population or 37% of the electorate voted for leave, that is not a democratic outcome. So we need to contest, we need to push back on these claims. We need to point out that these are misleading and indeed dishonest claims. The Prime Minister has been clear that there can be no attempts to remain inside the EU, no attempts to rejoin it through the back door, and no second referendum. The Prime Minister has been clear that there can be no attempts to remain inside the EU. Well, what are we all doing here tonight if this is not an attempt to remain in the EU? And who is she to say that we can't make every effort to remain in the EU, that we can't be meeting here together tonight? The Prime Minister has been clear that there can be no attempts to remain inside the EU, no attempts to rejoin it through the back door. Now that is meant to imply no soft Brexit, no remaining in the single market, no remaining within the customs union, no accepting of free movement of people, a point we need to come back to because lots of claims are made about the fact that the Leave campaign is premised on the anxieties about immigration. And finally, no second referendum. Well, if that had been a statement made by Mr. Harold Wilson in 1975, would anybody have taken it seriously? We have this referendum and there can be no second referendum. What, ever? Or is there no question of the fact that the government, which doesn't yet have any idea, although we're going to hear tomorrow from Mrs. May about this perhaps, what it would actually be involved in terms of a Brexit, that there can be no further discussion on those terms, no question of inspection of them, and perhaps a decision about whether we accept them or not. Well, those remarks demonstrate intransigence. And it looks very much as though if you take the whole picture together, you take the intransigence of those remarks, you take the fact that every effort is being made by the government not to have a debate in Parliament on the referendum itself, but only much, much later on the Great Repeal Bill, no discussion of a parliamentary debate on any terms of Brexit and the like, it looks as though we are being hijacked by our own government, that an effort is being made really to hustle us as quickly as possible past the point of no return, so that all this talk about after we leave or after Brexit becomes normalized, and we're all forced into accepting that there is no way back. That is simply false. We're not even at the point where any kind of discussion in Parliament of the outcome of the referendum has occurred. We're not even at the point where a decision has been made on triggering Article 50. Now, at some point in the next couple of weeks, the Supreme Court is going to issue its judgment on whether or not there has to be a parliamentary discussion on whether or not Article 50 is to be triggered. And notice that a discussion about whether or not to trigger Article 50 is the same as the discussion about whether or not to accept the outcome of the referendum. It's exactly the same point. So if the Supreme Court agrees with the Divisional Court in saying, of course, Parliament must discuss this matter before there's any trigger of 50, if that is their decision, and that is the expected decision, Mrs. May's government has already got its contingency in place. It has already had a first reading of a bill, a 2-line bill, which just says Parliament is going to trigger, without any further debate at all. And it will try, therefore, to subvert the judgment of the Supreme Court on the role of Parliament in this matter by hustling Parliament past the point of no return. Now, this is unacceptable in a democracy of this kind, or a kind where we should be insisting on the fact that it is a representative democracy with a sovereign Parliament, and where these things have to be discussed by that Parliament, and discussed in a way which is properly and genuinely informed and in the interests of the country, and not of MPs keeping their seats or of one wing of one political party. So the very, very first target, and this is the third point now, the point about what we're to do, the very first target has to be our members of Parliament. And not just your own member of Parliament in your own constituency. And don't mind if you know that your member of Parliament is a leaver. You've got to keep harassing them. You've got to keep writing. You've got to keep knocking on the door of the constituency office. You've got to keep making their lives miserable. Don't forget that MPs are full-time in their job as members of Parliament. It is their duty, their responsibility, and we taxpayers are paying their salary to do this full-time. So they should be open season on MPs to be lobbied and harassed and argued with and written to constantly. And don't give up. It is very, very effective. I was told a number of years ago by a senior civil servant in the Department of Health that one letter will slightly worry a minister, but 12 letters will make a minister break out into sweat. The reason being that every letter is regarded by a minister as being the tip of an iceberg. And if there start to be several of them coming in, if you start to get 12 or 15 or 20, they begin to take it very seriously. So writing to MPs, visiting constituency surgeries, and keeping this up, keeping it up, not accepting these kind of letters that we get back. And I've been writing to MPs ever since the referendum happened. And 2 or 3 of them write back in sensible terms. A dozen or 2 of them write back extremely rudely. And most of them write back saying, the people have expressed their will. Yeah. They write back to them and say, I'm sorry, that is incorrect. They write back and say, the country has voted to leave. You write back and say, no, that's not correct. They write back and say, Britain has decided to leave. And you write back and say, no. And you just keep on writing at them. So the first line of defense has to be our members of Parliament. Because if we can persuade our members of Parliament of their duty and of the fact that Parliament has it within its right and in its power to do something about this, if we could persuade them, then we might be able to save the day. So that would be the first target. It would be the simplest and most direct thing to do. And what it is we have to persuade them about is to think about the interests of the country and not about retaining their own parliamentary seat, or the fact that the whips in their party are going to give them a bad time by threatening to reveal their relationship with their mistress or whatever it might be, the kind of thing that whips typically use to dragoon votes in the House of Commons. So we have to persuade them to do that. That's tremendously important. To do it politely and to do it with good arguments, to do it relatively briefly. If you write very, very, very long letters to them, the longer the letter, the less likely they are to read it. But to do this in a concerted, persistent, and insistent way. That's the first line of action. The second line of action is already in play. There is the Supreme Court decision to come soon, and there are several other actions coming into the courts. There's one that my friend Jolyon Maugham is running in Dublin, because of the very difficult position that the north and the south of Ireland are in relation to the reintroduction of borders between the UK and the rest of the EU. That particular action has as its target getting a judgment on whether or not Article 50, if invoked, can be uninvoked again in future, whether it's revocable. Whether, for example, if it were triggered, then there were negotiations, and the negotiations issued in a deal which was palpably worse than being in the EU, and there was a general election or another referendum about it, we could say, no, we untrigger the Article 50 and we just remain in the EU. That is the purpose behind that legal challenge. There's yet another legal challenge coming in because there are other articles of other treaties and agreements, including the Lisbon Treaty, which have now come into focus and over which there can be challenges. So we will see those coming on stream in the near future. One of the hopes behind these challenges is that they will delay the process, that they will put stumbling blocks in the way of the process, giving time for argument and change of sentiment. We're already seeing that there's quite a lot of regretting going on the part of some leavers, and as the facts emerge about the impact of a possible Brexit, so that change of mind comes more and more into focus. So delaying and succeeding in these legal challenges is a very powerful additional line of defence. So MPs first, and these legal means second. And one thing you will notice about both of them is that they are both peaceful and they are both democratic. And I think it is essential for the third thing I'm going to suggest, that everything that we do should be peaceful and should be democratic. We've seen some leavers say that if they don't get their way, there's going to be riots in the streets. That is unacceptable in a democratic order. That kind of effort to coerce, to threaten, to intimidate is not acceptable, and we shouldn't accept intimidation. So everything that the Remain campaign does should and must be peaceful and democratic. And that includes the third thing I'm going to suggest, which is this. I quoted to you those intransigent words of Dexew. No referendum, no discussion in Parliament before it's all over, and it's only a discussion about the repeal bill. No going back, no taking into account the Remain campaign. And by the way, just open a little footnote here. When I talked earlier about only 37% of the electorate, if you just stuck with the numbers of the people who voted, over 48% of people voted to Remain. Nearly half the people who came out to vote, who are being entirely ignored in this whole process. And even if we were just to stick to the referendum voting numbers themselves, this is unconscionable. That they have no voice, they have no say, their interests and their needs and their aims are completely excluded. And those very, very intransigent words of Dexew, therefore, suggest to us our third line of defence, which is to take some kind of action, which I was reported in the India on Sunday as saying that we should have a general strike. Now, actually, I said it would be legitimate to have something like a general strike, but then you know what newspapers are like. I said that I called for one. Well, yes, I think if we found an imaginative and effective set of actions which amounted to something that was similar in outcome, I mean, I think a general strike of the 1926 variety is now probably a little bit difficult to organise. After all, most of us do things that if we went on strike, nobody would notice for quite a long time. So it may be that just staying at home is not exactly the idea. One of the ironies of the situation is that if you really wanted to go on strike, you would have to get a minimum of 40% of your total union to agree, a higher threshold than the one for leaving the EU, which is a really ironic situation. But if we could think of an imaginative and effective way of taking action which would bring pressure to bear on our parliamentarians and on our government, we need to think about what that would be. For example, supposing you could persuade the brokers in the City of London to stop trading for a few days. The impact on GDP and on the country at large would be very, very considerable. One has one's doubts as to whether brokers are going to be persuaded to stop trading for a minute, let alone for a few days. But the kind of thing that we need to imaginatively construct as a form of national protest is something that we need to look for and discuss and then have the courage to implement. Because that would be a striking and perhaps powerful way of having the will of the 48% of voters, of the over 60% of the electorate, of 3/4 of the country taken care of, who at the moment are simply not in the picture at all. Any other strategies, any other ways that we can think of, including, for example, trying to persuade and to encourage our fellow citizens who did vote for leave that this would be a great mistake. That is something else too. Work on the sentiment of our fellow citizens on this matter. Stand up and be counted. Tell people what your view is. Come out in the rain on a demonstration. I mean, when you consider how very small the numbers of people are who go on demonstrations. It's the great miners' demonstration in London back in the early 1980s, you may remember, is a tiny fraction of the population as a whole. But if you think of what happened in 1989, day after day in Wenceslas Square in Prague or in Berlin, if you think about those great mass movements that happened then, they certainly did have a huge impact. Why? Because almost all governments are rather like the Wizard of Oz. Do you remember in the Wizard of Oz how when finally Dorothy and the rest of them got to Oz and they confronted the wizard and the rather frightening facade that the wizard had, and when the cardboard facade fell down, there was a little chap in his polka-dotted underpants standing behind them, and to some extent that's what governments are like when eventually people really stand up and oppose them. And we've got to find a way of mobilizing and rallying people so that we can do that. We want to say no to Brexit. That is the message that we want to insist on and to make as clear and effective as possible. So look at at all the considerations, the facts that need to be borne in mind, the strategies that we can adopt, first and foremost, to change the minds of our MPs and to get them to do what they should be doing in the interests of our country, and then thinking about those other things that we can do too, but being determined to act. It's simply not enough to wish and to will and to hope. We have to act, and every single person in this room might be able to influence some other people to act likewise, and eventually we might be able to push down that cardboard facade and have a good look at the polka dot underpants behind. Thank you very much, everybody.